All right, today is Friday, and I am unfortunately not with you guys today, but that does not mean that we can't still work. So what we're going to do today, we're going to have notes, just like we normally do. They're going to appear on the screen. I'm going to talk just like I normally would. I'm just not going to be in the room. I have asked the guest teacher that if you guys get behind or if we're going a little too fast, which might happen, they are welcome to press the pause button, let you guys get caught up, and then we will continue, okay? So let's go ahead and get started. You should have had the objectives copied down already. Keep in mind that I may take these notes when I get back to check to make sure you did your work. So, goodness, I hope you wrote them down, okay? So let's go ahead and get started. Today we're going to be talking about cellular respiration. You know about photosynthesis, and you're going to find that cellular respiration is a lot like the opposite of photosynthesis. As a matter of fact, in just a second, I'll show you that it's exactly the opposite in some ways. So we are going to talk about why it's important. We're going to talk about the different parts to it, just like photosynthesis had a light reaction and a dark reaction. Cellular respiration has a couple of steps. And of course, all of this happens in the mitochondria, which you guys know about. And then there are two types of cellular respiration that we're going to distinguish between aerobic and anaerobic. So we're going to get to that here in just a second. So let's first talk about cellular respiration. Well, what is it? Cellular respiration is a complex process in which cells make ATP by breaking down organic compounds like glucose. All right. Now, if you recall, photosynthesis was the making of ATP and storing it in the form of glucose. Cellular respiration is taking glucose and releasing the energy in the form of ATP. So photosynthesis is a way of storing energy. Cellular respiration is a way of letting it out. Okay? Now, just like photosynthesis had the summary equation, this is the summary equation for cellular respiration. C6H12O6 plus O2 yields CO2 and H2O. That is, glucose and oxygen produce carbon dioxide and water. Now, if you look back to your notes on photosynthesis, you will notice one stark reality, and that is that the summary equation for cellular respiration is the exact opposite for photosynthesis. They are the opposite of each other, which makes sense because photosynthesis is the storing of energy while cellular respiration is the releasing of that stored energy. They are literally complementary of each other. They are the circle of life. They're often referred to as a cycle because as one organism produces it, the other organism uses it to produce something else that the other organism needs, and then again we create this sort of circular pattern. Now, cellular respiration happens in a couple of steps. The first step we're going to talk about is glycolysis. Hold on one second. Let me go back here. Guest teacher, if you'd like to pause now to let everybody get caught up, you may pause now, and then we'll move on. All right, moving on to the first step of cellular respiration, glycolysis. Now, glycolysis, if we look at it in terms of what the word means, it makes complete sense. Glyco refers to glucose. Lysis, which we've already learned, means to break down. So glycolysis is a chemical process in which we break down glucose into a substance called pyruvic acid. Now, here's how it happens. Two phosphate groups will come along and attach themselves to a glucose molecule. Now, to do this, we're going to need to use some energy, okay? So what happens here is that we have to spend energy to get energy. Just like people often say you have to spend money to make money. This is the similar process. Two phosphate groups attach to the glucose molecule using two ATP molecules, and they rip the molecules apart, creating two pyruvic acid molecules. All right? So the glucose and the phosphate join each other. All right? So that what ends up happening is we have taken that glucose molecule and we split it apart into two halves. We can pause here and get caught up. Continuing on with glycolysis, the third step is that an additional phosphate group is going to come by to each half of the glucose molecules with the phosphates. This is pyruvic acid, all right? And what happens here is the 4 phosphates are going to rip off the energy and turn 4 ADP molecules into 4 ATP molecules. All right, so we have 4 phosphates popping off those glucoses, and we end up with 4 ATP molecules. So right now we have a net of 2 ATPs produced because we used 2 and we produced 4. 4 minus 2, of course, is 2. There is one thing to note here, though. We haven't used oxygen yet. All right, oxygen's going to come later. We also note that this is really not that efficient. Okay, if we spin 2 and only get 4, which is a net of 2, it really isn't that much of an advantage. Okay, we're going to go ahead and pause here, let you get caught up, and then we're going to move on to the next step past glycolysis. The next step is called fermentation. Now, again, we still haven't added oxygen yet. Fermentation is the process that replaces the molecules that we used in glycolysis. There are 2 types. First of all, there's lactic acid fermentation. Now, this often happens in muscle cells, and it converts that pyruvic acid, which we showed you earlier, into lactic acid. Now, the downside to lactic acid is, first of all, it would make your muscles very sore, and it has to break down in the presence of oxygen. So, if you've ever worked out or run really hard or just had a really rough workout in any way, you realize that your muscles get sore. The reason is that your muscles were working so hard that you didn't have enough oxygen to produce the energy you needed. So what happened is the whole cellular respiration process didn't really work its way all the way through. The only way to get rid of that is to put oxygen in the system. So if you look at professional athletes, often they will come off the sidelines and then they will put an oxygen mask on. The reason for that is they want to prevent from getting sore, so what they're going to do is breathe in a lot of oxygen to prevent that lactic acid from building up and causing that soreness in their muscles. The other type of fermentation is called alcohol fermentation. This converts pyruvic acid into ethyl alcohol, and of course this is the process used to produce beer, wine, and other alcohol products. Yeast is a common example of a type of cell or organism that undergoes alcohol fermentation. We're going to go ahead and pause here and let you get caught up. All right, so we were talking about respiration, cellular respiration, in the form of with oxygen and without. Okay, we've already talked about what happens without oxygen. So what is that called? Well, fermentation and glycolysis happen in the cytoplasm of a cell, and they do not use oxygen. That means that they are anaerobic. If you look at the etymology or the meaning of the parts of the word anaerobic, an means without, aero means oxygen. So we're talking about without oxygen. Cellular respiration can continue in the mitochondria in the presence of oxygen and produce much more energy. So what we're saying is anaerobic respiration really isn't that efficient because we really do need oxygen for the most part. It can happen without, but it's not very efficient. If we have aerobic respiration, which is with oxygen respiration, what we're talking about is much more energy being produced. Okay? So, after glycolysis occurs, and we break apart those glucose molecules, and then we provide oxygen in the mitochondria, what's going to happen is that we're able to produce a massive amount of energy from one glucose molecule, and that's what we're going to talk about next. After you get this copied down, we'll go ahead and pause now for you guys to get this written down. All right, aerobic respiration. Now, we've already covered anaerobic respiration. Fermentation, glycolysis, that's what we just talked about. That's anaerobic. Now let's add oxygen. The Krebs cycle is responsible for creating 2 ATP molecules from CO2 and the energy required to produce more ATP. In other words, the Krebs cycle gets started up, and then what happens is it produces enough energy to power the rest of the process. Okay, so it's making the energy that we need. The electron transport chain in a process called chemiosmosis or chemiosmosis continues using oxygen to create ATP. So for aerobic respiration to happen, we have to start with an anaerobic process of glycolysis. But then we enter into the Krebs cycle and we really start to get things going. At the end of the aerobic and anaerobic respiration in a cell, we can produce 38 ATP molecules from 1 molecule of glucose. Obviously, aerobic respiration is much, much more efficient, right? Well, don't forget we did spend some energy. We did spend 2 ATP molecules to fuel the process from glycolysis. That gives us a net production of 36 ATP molecules from 1 molecule of glucose. Now compare that to anaerobic respiration where we had a net production of 2, right? We produced 4 but used 2. That's a total of net 2. Here we make 38, we use 2, net production is 36. That's a whole lot more energy. All right? So aerobic respiration is really the preferred path. We'll go ahead and pause and let you get caught up. Let's talk about the efficiency of cellular respiration, because we've talked about this before. Cellular respiration is a fairly efficient process compared to other energy conversion processes. All right, and we can give you some examples. However, remember, all living processes, from the production of energy to the storing of energy to any sort of metabolic thing that happens, is governed by certain criteria. For example, the temperature, the acidity or alkalinity or pH, the percent of food that's available, the existing amount of energy, are all playing a role. I mean, if we have a whole bunch of ATP hanging around, we're probably not going to produce ATP very efficiently because we have plenty. I mean, you don't produce a whole bunch of stuff that you already have plenty of. That would just be a waste. But to give you some note, aerobic respiration is about 39% efficient. That's pretty good. As far as efficiency goes, it does, I mean, pretty tough. We're going to lose some energy every time. So anaerobic respiration or glycolysis is only 2% efficient. Comparatively, they don't even stand close. Your automobile, for example, is 25% efficient, and that depends on how old it is and what kind of model it is and what kind of engine it's got and all that. But that should make you a little angry, because this means that for every dollar you pay in gas, you're getting less than a quarter's worth of energy. The rest of it is lost as heat, and that's kind of a waste, isn't it? Yeah. So we're going to go ahead and pause here. The next thing we're going to do is talk about your objectives. All right, let's take a look at the objectives, and hopefully we've learned everything we need to know. First of all, you need to know the summary equation for cellular respiration. That is, glucose plus oxygen yields carbon dioxide and water, or C6H12O6 plus O2 yields CO2 plus H2O. If you didn't get that, you need to make sure you copy that from your notes. The next one, why is cellular respiration important? Well, it's incredibly important because if plants have the ability to store energy, we as organisms that use that energy need to be able to release it. Okay? Photosynthesis is the lock. Cellular respiration is the key. Okay? Without cellular respiration, we couldn't harness the energy we get from all the things that we eat. If we differentiate glycolysis, fermentation, and the Krebs cycle, there's a couple of things that help us. First of all, glycolysis is the breaking down of glucose. That happens in all cellular respiration. That's where it all starts. But if cellular respiration stops with glycolysis, it's not very efficient. We're only getting about 2 ATP out of it. Fermentation is what we do with the leftover stuff from glycolysis that doesn't get fully processed. All right? And the Krebs cycle is what takes us all the way through to the end, where we take from glycolysis to the Krebs cycle to produce more ATP. And the Krebs cycle is an aerobic process, whereas glycolysis and fermentation are anaerobic, meaning without oxygen. The role of the mitochondria in cellular respiration is the aerobic respiration. Okay, remember that glycolysis, fermentation, both of those happen in the cytoplasm of the cell. Only in the mitochondria does the aerobic respiration happen, where we're providing oxygen to release that energy. So that's important, because remember, aerobic respiration is more efficient. So that's why we call the mitochondria the powerhouse of the cell, because yeah, our cells can produce energy or can release energy, but not nearly efficient as they do with the mitochondria, where the mitochondria really lets stuff loose and really gives us a lot of ATP, which is what we need. And finally, what is the difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration? Very simple. Aerobic respiration happens with oxygen. Anaerobic respiration happens without. All right. Your assignment today will be to complete your study guides, part 3 and 4, which means your whole study guide will be due on Monday. You should have plenty of time to get that finished today, so you don't have much homework. But if you don't, again, you do need to complete parts 3 and 4 for homework. And I look forward to seeing you guys on Monday. All right? See you later.